I'm the Turner Bledsoe. I am the co-coordinator of 350 Mass South Shore, which is part of a grassroots, statewide organization fighting climate change. At this point, I was going to introduce our minister, but he is now with the fire department working on a boiler plant. His job description goes on for pages. So, I'm going to tell you what Ken would have told you a little bit about the church. First of all, he would have welcomed you here. This is known as the Old Ship Meeting House. It was built in 1681. It is the last of about 200 such buildings that were built in colonial times before we were a nation. We are the last one that's left. It is also the oldest wooden church in the United States in continuous religious use. We go back to the Puritans, and now this is a Unitarian Universalist church. We don't know how the Puritans feel about it, but they haven't sent any poltergeists, so we feel secure in what we're doing here. This event tonight is especially appropriate for here because it was called a meeting house. They did not call it a church. Their belief was, and of course there was no separation of church and state in those days, everybody had the same religion. During the week, this was their city or town hall where all secular issues came up and were discussed. On the weekends, on Sundays, it was the church. So here we are in the middle of the week, Thursday evening, and we're discussing something very important for everybody sitting here. I want to thank you all first for coming this evening, but before I say that, I have been asked if I would point out to the fact that we have some sign-ups out there. Several places are represented, but probably the most exciting thing that's going on is that a Tesla automobile. I've had the pleasure of riding in one, in fact the one that's parked out there. It is not only a very efficient car, all electric, it is a gorgeous car. I would say it's the Rolls Royce of today. Anyway, Rod Breslow, who is on our panel tonight, his organization, Climate Exchange, is raffling this off. They've obviously gotten this wonderful gift from somebody to be able to do that, to raise funds. So take a look at the one that's out there. That's not the one that's on raffle, but something as beautiful and as wonderful as that. So take a look at that. I want to thank you again for coming this evening. We're going to discuss the effects climate change has had in this region, which we all can see have been profound. And we're going to discuss something called carbon pricing, a term that probably isn't familiar to many of you, but which has turned out to be very effective in fighting global warming. We have a terrific panel of environmentalists tonight, people who have been in the forefront of this struggle since long before the current crisis, so that they are able to explain simply and succinctly what is going on and how we energy consumers actually have the power to help turn the rising tide. They are Mark Breslow, this gentleman right here, our keynote speaker. He's a longtime environmentalist who has founded 2 major clean energy advocacy groups in the Commonwealth, and as a member of Governor Deval Patrick's administration, had a leading role in developing and writing the state's clean energy and climate plan for 2020. The others are Andre Martini, an engineer who has consulted with several South Shore towns about the serious effects climate change has had in this region and what might be in store for us. Lana Zamaro, beautiful lady right over there. Just an aside, because she is. Who is Energy and Resource Conservation Specialist for the Massachusetts League of Women Voters, testified before the state legislature in favor of a carbon fee bill. And Kathy Buckley, at the far end, she's chairman of the Massachusetts chapter of the Sierra Club, the oldest and one of the most influential environmental organizations in the United States. It's now my pleasure to introduce Andre, who happens to be a Duxbury resident, so knows this area very well.
Thank you, Connie. I'm very excited to be here. I've been involved with a bunch of projects doing more on the adaptation side. So I think the topic that we're really going to be talking about tonight is much more on the mitigation side. In other words, what are we going to do to help reduce the chances of climate change in the future? I'm dealing with the reality of adapting to it. So a lot of my projects, we did actually one, just completed one here in Hingham. We're doing one currently in Hull. We did Duxbury, South Marshfield, and Situate. We're doing one in Oak Bluffs, in Gloucester, Cambridge, Boston, and so on. So what I'd like to talk a little bit about today is, first of all, we'll start with sea level rise. We'll focus on sea level rise. So many times when I do these talks, people come up to me and say, this is, climate change is a bunch of crap. And so you have to kind of first set the table and say, you may not agree, you may not think it's happening, but the reality is, this is tide gauge, everybody can see. This is tide gauge data, it's actual measured data in this one happens to be in Boston, but if you look at tide gauges up and down the coast, they're all the same. Sea level is rising, so it's a fact. This one is monitoring back to about 1920s, and you can see there's a general progression, roughly 8 inches or so over the past couple of years. So what causes sea level rise? Well, first of all, it's obviously the global warming of the ocean. So as the temperatures are rising, due to greenhouse gases, due to a whole lot of things, the temperature's rising, the water warms. The water, if you remember our Deflategate, PV equals NR, that whole formula. Well, as the temperature of the water goes up, the volume goes up also. It's a direct. And so the ocean floor is fixed, so the only thing that water can do is go up. So not only that, but there's melting glaciers, and part of the problem is, especially in the Antarctic and the Arctic, as the water is becoming exposed, instead of having white ice that reflects the heat, the darker water absorbs heat and actually accelerates that. And then there's other issues with local sea level rise, subsidence of land, where in some cases where plate tectonics are actually pushing plates up, sea level rise is going down. We happen not to be in that lucky situation. And there are some changes in ocean currents. So how do we know that things are actually happening? This is a piece of ice, and there's a lot of ice coring that's being done to look at this historically. And that ice contains bubbles, and the bubbles have all kinds of, you can look at the types of air, what's in the air, and they can date the carbon, the amount of carbon dioxide, they look at all kinds of things. So, for the people who don't believe that carbon dioxide is increasing, this is from some ice cores taken from long ago. And going all the way back, in this particular graph goes to 300,000 years. It goes back to 800,000 years before. And from that, you can see that the blue line is the carbon dioxide concentrations, and the red line is temperature. So you can see that throughout this, as carbon dioxide goes up, so does temperature. Well, a lot of people say that, oh, this is man-made, this is not man-made, this is just a natural cycle. So for people who claim that, well, yes, they're right. You can see that we're here now, somewhere in this time period. So, 100,000 years ago, and now we're coming up. So for the people who say that that we're just in a natural cycle, it's not man-made, they're right. But the reality is that if you start looking at what's happened here, historically the carbon levels of CO2 are, somewhere in this range here in the 280, maybe 300 max. Look at, this was in 2007, up in the 383 parts per million in this particular sample. So the reality is that if that concept that temperature tracks closely with carbon dioxide levels, that's the precursor that things are warming up. And so there have been many studies done that look at, again, the historical range of carbon dioxide, but then there's some modeling that's being done that says this is where we are today, this is slightly below 400. But now with different scenarios of modeling going to the turn of the century, there could be some dramatic increases. And so this is where the idea of how do we control this is extremely important. So what does this translate to? When we talk about sea level rise, we're looking at, again, today, this is historic data, and this is where we are today, in roughly the early 2000s. And there are a series of projections that go forward. And which curve you choose is dependent on which models you believe. Most of the planning that we're doing in this area is actually being based on the higher level curve. And there are scientists that are actually predicting that these curves are even on the lower end of the spectrum going forward. So, but all the modeling that we'll look at today is actually based on the higher curve. So, let's just talk a little bit about the water surface modeling. So one of the things that when we're talking about water, you have sea level rise, but you also have storm surge. And for those who, everybody kind of thinks they know what storm surge is, but really what it is, when you have a big storm, and think of the hurricane, the eye of the hurricane, it's a low pressure system. So what happens is the low pressure system literally sucks the water. It's just low pressure. There's not enough pressure pushing, and it literally is sucking the water column is rising. Not only that, there's due to wind, so there's a wind effect from the storm. So that's what's causing your storm surge. So there are different ways to model. In a study that we did for Marshfield, Duxbury, and Scituate, we used a model called SLOSH, which is actually what the NOAA uses to model hurricanes. When we get an actual hurricane like Joaquin recently, they would use SLOSH to model the storm surge effects going forward. On the Hingham and Hall and most of the recent ones that we're doing, we're actually using a model that Woods Hole Group, a very well-known modeling consultant based in Falmouth. They are using a model called ADSER. And this model is a model that, this is Hingham, for example, and it has this really intense mesh. And this mesh goes all the way down to the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico. Because what happens is, when you look at the storms, they model just, hundreds and hundreds of storms that are put into this model. And that grid mesh that you see, every one of those little nodes in that mesh has its water surface elevation, it's a risk, so you can get probabilities of exceedance, all kinds of stuff. And that's the data that we're using. So I'm going to focus on just Hingham because Hull results aren't quite ready yet, so I can't release those yet. Needless to say, it doesn't look good. But we'll talk about Hingham, where we modeled 2015, 2030, and 2070. And then in Marshfield, Duxbury, and Scituate, we had the present day was 2013, and then we did 25, 50, and 75-year sort of outlooks going forward. So for Hingham, what we ended up looking at, and I know it's kind of hard to see, but just to kind of focus really quickly, I think we are right over here somewhere. But the areas of the coast, this is for 2030, and different colors look at different depths of water. But you can see the harbor area has some areas of concern, and the area that's going over towards Hull, some of the roads over here, and then the Broad Cove area where the school is if you look at 2070, this is, oh, actually, this is just sea level rise alone, so I'm not going to focus on that. But again, for the coast, if you look at 2030 and 2070 for just sea level rise alone, never mind any storm surge, you know, the coast is still pretty contained. So, which is good news, because twice a day that tide is coming up, and if you were having, as you get into the 2070 time frame, you start to get a little bit more impact of overtopping. And then if you look at the sea level rise, this is in Broad Cove, and the elementary school is up here. You can see that by 2070 we start to actually get water in the parking lots twice a day. So that's not too good. So then if we look at storm, now we're looking at water surface today, so this is our current situation, with, we're calling this the 1% probability that this is actually going to, the maximum water surface. And again, you see these areas have some, the darker the color, the deeper the water. And a lot of these areas, you know, these are wetlands, so it doesn't look worse than it is. But, you know, you have a little bit here. But then as you get out to 2030, as you start to go to 2030, you start seeing that the Broad Cove area gets a little deeper. It starts coming out now into the little business district here. This is like a 1% storm chance of having like a 100-year event, and a little bit more in this area. And then as you get into 2070, now you start seeing, you know, the purples are up to like 4 feet of water. Now you have a business district here, you have some, you know, this is an important commercial area in the town of Hingham. And then it starts to actually also come through here. It affects the Route 3A. So Hingham is actually, I think, starting to look at a project among a larger project to actually look at what to do with Route 3A, and that may include some flood walls or raising the road or a combination. So, and then these are some other, I'm not going to get, I mean, if you look at, again, you start to see some just focus areas, but the idea is that it definitely is, as it starts to get deeper, you can start seeing, see, these are all the businesses down here. You have a pump station, which is right in the road, in the flood area, and as you get to 2070, those purples are getting into the deeper water. So there is definitely a consequence of climate change that, you know, the town of Hingham is going to be dealing with. If you look at, we did some graphical representations, and these are actual, you know, taking into account the angles and everything. So this is Route 3A with a 1% chance in 2030, but with a 1% storm in 2070, this is what it means. And you know, this area, keep in mind, does occasionally flood even today. So one of the conclusions that we found is that areas that flood today obviously are going to get only worse. This is also down close to the rotary on Route 3A, and you know, again in 2070 it looks a lot worse. So now just to switch over a little bit to Marshfield, Duxbury, and Situate, in case any of you happen to be from there. This is Front Street, the main harbor area. So you have the big parking lot here. This is sea level rise only. So in 25 years, there's about a foot, call it, of sea level, potential sea level rise. But by 75 years, it's somewhere in the order of 5 feet. So that's what the water will be, theoretically, if this were to happen, twice a day. And obviously that's a problem for downtown Situate. Similarly, if you now start adding storm surge with the sea level rise, you can see that obviously you get some pretty deep water starting to happen. And this area, by the way, has flooding problems even today when you get a bad nor'easter coming in. So, and again, if you look at a rendering of what that looks like, potentially, it is obviously, and the dilemma here is now, when we talk about adaptation, what do you do here? You have a roadway, you have buildings right next to the sidewalks and the doors of every building coming down Front Street. So if you say, oh, I can raise the road, that's great, but at what cost? And everybody has to work together to solve these problems. Similarly in Marshville, this is the Brant Rock area over here. This is Dyke Road. But again, as you start seeing that there are some large, we have maps for the whole area, and it's a very significant problem. And again, as you get worse with this was modeled with a Category 1 hurricane. We have had Category 3 hurricanes, not for a long time, luckily, but this is a Category 1, which is a relatively minor hurricane event. And this is, again, this is their sewer treatment plant, which luckily the parking lot floods, but the actual building and the sewer treatment facility in this scenario doesn't flood. So with that, that's it. So I'm not sure if you want to do questions or at the end. Okay. Great.
Okay. We have Mark Breslow.
So, my name's Mark Breslow. I'm with an organization called Climate Exchange, which is part of a coalition that's called the Massachusetts Campaign for a Clean Energy Future, which has just come together in the last year to specifically advocate for putting a price or a charge or a fee on carbon, by which we mean carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels. As you know, probably, the state and the federal governments have lots of different policies that are intended to affect energy efficiency of cars, of homes, of industrial processes, and there's lots of different regulatory policies to do that, some of which have forced most of the coal plants in Massachusetts to shut already, and the remaining ones will be shut in the next few years. One policy that hasn't really been done very much is the simplest policy, which is to raise the price of fossil fuels. And it's pretty obvious. You make something more expensive, people use less of it. And that's true even for energy, which is kind of a necessity of life, and it's hard to get people to use less of it. But it's still true if you raise the price, people will move toward energy that's non-fossil fuel based and will do more energy efficiency. Just out of curiosity, how many people sitting here have had some kind of energy efficiency measure put into their homes? All right, so that's most people here. And how many of you, when you did that, made use of a discount or rebate or subsidy that was provided through the utilities? Okay, so that's most of the people who've done it. So Massachusetts has lots of programs like this. That's the best funded one. And all those are important. Our organization, Coalition, formed in order to go for this simple policy, which has not been done very much. And we'll get into it. Just as an introduction, talking about flooding, this is an actual picture taken in my neighborhood in 2010. I forget what storm that was, but I do not live near the coast. I live in Arlington, Mass. But my neighborhood was built on wetland, so it's very close to the water line. And after a fairly intense storm, my entire neighborhood was underwater. That is a street you're looking at. And that's what we're afraid, one of the things that might be happening much more often in the future. All right, so carbon pricing, the idea that you're going to charge people more for using fossil fuels. And that could also be done for other greenhouse gases, which in Massachusetts also exist, but are a smaller, much smaller piece of the problem. So we want that higher price to cause people and businesses to shift toward renewable energy and energy efficiency. The logic is pretty simple there. You do need fairly high changes in price if you're going to get that much of a shift, because energy, electricity, natural gas, gasoline are things that people can't do without very easily, and it's fairly expensive to make shifts. So any of you who've maybe changed the heating system in your home from an older one to a more efficient one know that it's costing now probably $8,000 or more to replace a heating system. In general, economists and many policy analysts, but particularly economists, are favorable toward carbon pricing because they, or we, I'm an economist, think that the simplicity of a price increase that causes a change in behavior is a less costly way of getting people to use less fossil fuel. We have a huge volume of regulations in Massachusetts and nationally, some of which I worked on, that are complex, difficult to administer, and have to be changed over time if you're going to keep reducing emissions. Whereas with a price on carbon, you could say, as the bill we're working on does, it's going to start at one price, and it's going to keep going up over time, and this is the schedule we're planning on, and everybody can know it in advance and start shifting their behavior. It's much harder to do that with regulations, much more complex. My organization, Climate Exchange, is specifically promoting one form of carbon pricing, but we would also support other forms. So carbon pricing means raising the price. Then the question becomes, what do you do with the money that that raises? And it will, if you have a decently sized carbon price, enough to shift people's behavior, raise a lot of money, in the billions just in Massachusetts. And you could use that money for government programs, and part of our coalition actually would prefer that at least part of the money be used that way. Climate Exchange's position is that we should return all the money to the public. And the reason for arguing that is that we don't want the debate over trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to be mixed up with the debate over taxes. Taxes are a dirty word in the state. It's very hard to get changes passed. So if you do something where you raise the price of fossil fuels, but you then return all the money to the public, then you could say that this is revenue neutral, it's not raising taxes, it's not increasing the size of government, and you hopefully shift the politics of the debate. And there is legal reasoning which can justify saying that even though you might call this a carbon tax, that if you're returning all the money, it's valid to not call it a tax, to call it a fee or a pollution charge. There are a number of places in the world that have carbon taxes or taxes on energy use of various kinds, particularly in Europe, and there are also cap and trade programs which indirectly create a price on carbon. We have one here for power plants called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's also one in California. All those raise money for the state. The only place we're aware of that's similar enough to us and that does a revenue-neutral version is the province of British Columbia in Canada, which has had this since 2008, where it put a price on carbon that, in Canadian dollars, or translated to US dollars, started at, I think, $5 a ton, and it went up to $30, which is where it is now. And to put that in understandable terms, $30 a ton is about 27 cents on a gallon of gasoline. So it's a significant amount, but it's not an enormous amount, right? The price of gasoline is varied by much more than that. So this has existed in British Columbia for 7 years now, and it has all worked well the way it was designed, where this provincial government takes in all this money, but it returns it through a variety of tax breaks, mostly to business tax breaks, personal income tax breaks, some money directed at poor people who don't generally, if they're not paying any taxes, and some extra money directed at the rural areas of the state where people drive more and also have farms where they use a lot of machinery that uses fossil fuel. So they've designed a system that works specifically well in British Columbia. We would do it somewhat differently here. Fuel use as a result of this policy has dropped quite a bit, by 16% in British Columbia in just 7 years, which is a pretty substantial change. It's also actually helped the economy, just like in Mass, industries that derive from clean energy, that install solar panels, that install wind turbines, that do energy efficiency, and so on, have increased greatly there, and that the same phenomenon is already happening here. And even though it's acknowledged, it's called a tax there, even though it's revenue neutral, it's managed to maintain political support. There are 2 carbon pricing bills in the Massachusetts legislature. One is S-1747, which is the Senate, by Senator Barrett of Lexington, which is the revenue neutral bill. There's a second bill, S-1786, by Senator Pacheco, which isn't that much different, but it would take 80% of the money and still return that to the public, but use 20% of the money for government programs that meet essential needs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that includes clean energy and also public transportation. So there are 2 variations on the same theme. Both of them are trying to use raising the price of CO2 to reduce fossil fuel use. I'm going to be focusing mostly from now to the end of my talk on the first bill, and that's in large part because the first bill is much more detailed in the way it's been constructed, and it's based on a study that was done for the state for the Department of Energy Resources a year ago, where I was part of the consulting team that did the study, and we have a bunch of results from that study that essentially would be replicated by this bill. So I can tell you in much more depth what would actually happen. So first, we set a bunch of criteria for what a carbon fee or charge should be. One, it's got to have a large potential to cut emissions. It's not worth doing this system if you're going to get just a small change. Second, we wanted it to cover the whole economy, so that it covered all sources of emissions. The bill actually doesn't quite do that. Third, revenue neutral. We were actually instructed by the state to model this that way. It should phase in gradually to give time to adjust. And perhaps most essential, it should protect low and moderate income people from their cost of living going up too much. Because we thought, without that, you're just going to kill this. And I particularly thought that you might be able to get a small carbon charge through, even if it's raising people's cost of living, but a small carbon charge doesn't make enough of a difference. If we're going to really change things, the carbon price has to get high. So, for example, in the modeling we did, and in Senator Barrett's bill, the carbon price goes up to $40 a ton eventually, which is 36 cents on a gallon of gas, which is significant, but it's still only 10% or so of the price of gas. If you really wanted to have a dramatic effect on getting people to shift, say, toward electric cars, you probably need to go up to, say, $1 a ton, which would be about 90 cents on a gallon of gasoline. It would cause a much larger shift. And it's my thinking and other people's that if you're going to get a charge that's big enough to really make a difference, you need to return the money to people so that it's not hurting their standard of living. It's shifting their behavior, but not causing their incomes to go down entirely. And that's the only way people are going to accept the idea of a charge that keeps going up until it makes a big difference in the economy. And you also need to protect businesses, at least some of which are energy intensive and will be impacted significantly by this. In the study, we we, and by we I should say, there's one of the other authors, not me, who has what's called an econometric model that does this kind of economic modeling. You can see in the slide the price of carbon was modeled all the way out to 2040 with 3 different levels of increase. The lowest level going to $50 a ton eventually, and the highest level going to $100 a ton. And we wanted to see what the impact would be of those 3 rates of increase. In Senator Barrett's bill, it goes up to 40 and stops there. And the results of this modeling in this econometric model were that you get 3 different levels of increase, where this is the base, without a carbon charge, which is already expected to drop because we have other policies pushing it that way. And then these are with 3 different levels of carbon charge. So the difference between this and this, which is close to 10% of the state's entire greenhouse gas emissions, is what we expect the change to create. It actually would be higher in some other states because Massachusetts has already done a lot on this score, and because due to those other policies, we are already pretty much eliminating coal-fired plants in the state, which are sort of the most susceptible thing to a higher price. There's many other states where you would get a bigger shift because they're still mainly relying on coal-fired power. And so in part, as with other things, Massachusetts would be a model for other states where you would actually get a greater impact. So then also important is then what do you do with the money? And this is kind of my specialty, because there are different ways that even if you don't use it for government programs, that you could return it back to the population. And how you return it makes a big difference in who benefits and how people come out on balance. So for example, you could reduce the income tax rate in Massachusetts, but if you did that, the result would be the higher people's income, the more they would benefit. And if you do the modeling, you find out that the higher your income, the more you'll come out ahead, and people with low incomes will actually come out behind, substantially behind, and people with the lowest incomes, who actually don't really pay any state income tax, are going to come out the worst under such a situation, because they're going to pay a higher prices for fossil fuels but get nothing back. So in the Barrett bill, the fee starts at $10 a ton, goes up $5 a year, and gets to $40. We decided to model, and Barrett put in his bill, exempting the electricity sector from this, and there's several reasons for that, one of which is that we already have a kind of pricing system for electricity plants, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's a couple other reasons that I'll skip for now. So the formula that we use in doing this modeling was, first we said that the amount of tax that's paid by households will go back to households, and the amount that's paid by businesses and other institutions will go back to them. And then from the money that goes back to households, instead of cutting a tax, we're just going to give an equal rebate to every person in the state. All right? So you have a household of 3 people, you get 3 of these rebates. It's not hard to picture, I hope, that if you do that, it spreads the benefits much more evenly. So a low-income family gets just as much benefit as a high-income family, and since a high-income family generally uses more energy, the result of my modeling on this is that the lower 60% of Massachusetts households measured by income will actually come out ahead if you do rebates this way, and the top 40% will come out somewhat behind. So you're essentially taking all the money that you take in and giving it back. And then we've also modeled what happens to businesses. And it's different for every type of business because they use energy in different ways. Again, we decided, for reasons that I'll skip, not to cut a tax rate, but instead to give rebates to businesses proportional to their number of employees. And then we modeled those results, and actually most of the sectors in the state come out ahead. Some business types come out behind because they're more energy intensive, and that includes construction, chemical manufacturing, a couple of other manufacturing sectors, and things like trucking, which obviously use a huge amount of fuel. We also asked, because it was important to the state, what about people who live in more rural areas? And I'm not sure how Hingham fits into that. Would you consider this a rural area or not? No? Okay. Compared to where I live, maybe. But, so the way we actually decided to measure that was by looking at how much driving people do. Because there actually is data due to the fact that you have to get an annual inspection where your odometer reading is recorded. The state actually knows how much driving has been done by every car in the state. And you can calculate the average amount of driving by town if you want to. So we actually did that. I had help with some graduate students manipulating this huge database. And we took a cutoff point and we said, let's look at just the towns where people do a lot more driving than average. By a lot more, we chose 30% more than the average for the whole state. Now, I don't know where Hingham or Duxbury or around here falls on that. How many people think you're 30% more than the average? Nobody does? Who knows? I could look it up for you. If you really want to know, I'll look it up. And what we decided is that people who do that much driving are going to be hurt more than average by this. So that the formula would give an extra rebate to people who live in communities like that to reduce the impact. And it turns out it's something like 15% of the state's population, but because it's mostly in smaller rural towns, it's actually almost half of the towns in the state, almost half of the municipalities, about 160 towns out of 351 municipalities in the state. So it's quite a number of them that would benefit from this particular design. And then this illustrates for you what would happen if you use our rebate design. This is for the bottom 20% of households, the poorest 20%. And what it shows you is that when the carbon tax rate is $30 per ton, the average household at the bottom of the income scale would be paying somewhat over $200 a year in carbon fees or taxes. However, they get back on average over $300 a year. So the net would be almost a gain of $100 a year for low-income households, which we thought was just great. And then this next slide shows you what happens to each fifth of the households. So you divide up the entire households in the state into groups of 20% of all of them, starting with the poorest on the left, group 1, and the wealthiest on the right. And what you see is that this is the tax, this is the rebate, and this is the net effect in the hash bar. And what you see is that the lower 60% of households come out ahead, and the higher 20%, the higher 40% come out behind. But it's not by huge amounts of money. So the top 20% are coming out behind by something like $120 a year, which is probably not enough to be terribly disruptive at the top levels. We also looked at what the impacts would be on different businesses. So this chart, which may be a little hard to read because of the green and black, looks at the biggest sectors of the state's economy. And what you see on this is the net gain or loss to a sector after they've paid the carbon fees and been given a rebate based on their number of employees. And what you see is that of the state's biggest sectors, the impact is pretty small, no matter where you are. It's a very small, much less than 1% of their total costs of operation. And 1, 2, 3, 4 of the largest sectors come out ahead, and 2 of them come out quite slightly behind. One of those is state and local government, comes out a little bit behind, and that's actually a concern because it's so hard for municipalities, particularly to actually raise taxes or get more money in. So we would need an adjustment there. However, the modeling that we did also says, and now I'm going back to the other staff members' modeling, that this would actually help employment in the state. And the reason for that is principally because we have no native fossil fuel in Massachusetts. We don't make any money off of fossil fuels, right? There is no coal, oil, or natural gas in our lands or offshore, which means we send about $20 billion a year out of state to pay for fossil fuels. It's all money that leaves the economy. About 20% of the money stays here just to pay for running gas stations and oil dealerships and so on. But we actually spend about $25 billion on energy, and about 80% of that, or $20 billion, leaves the state. If you put on this fee and we cut our use of fossil fuels, that's less money that leaves the state, that people will be spending on businesses in state. And the result is a fairly small but still real increase in employment. And what this chart says is that depending on the price rise, the increase in employment goes from about 9,000 jobs by 2040 to about 15,000 jobs. That's a pretty small fraction of the total employment in the state, but it is positive. And so I'm just finishing up now. So the conclusion is that if you do an economy-wide pricing system for carbon dioxide emissions, it's a feasible thing to do. It will substantially reduce emissions, and it will create jobs and not harm the economy. Also, the rebate system can be designed to protect most households and most businesses and other institutions. So we think this is a system that can work, that's simple, and that will help put us on the road to the state's commitment, which is to reduce our emissions by at least 80% by 2050. Thank you.
Well, I want to really thank 350 South Shore Node and others involved in this presentation this evening for inviting me to be here on behalf of the League of Women Voters. We have been involved and are very proud to be members of the coalition, the Massachusetts Campaign for a Clean Energy Future, and it's just great to be here. It's a gorgeous venue. I have to say, though, I'm wondering to what extent I'm speaking to the choir here. So, most of you know the League of Women Voters as an organization that's focused on voter registration, voter access, candidate forms, and transparent government. What we call the gears or the fundamentals of making democracy work. A major focus of the League since 2010 in the Citizens United decision has been efforts to combat the influence of big money in our political system. Not only because that money is increasingly drowning out the voices of individual voters, but also because that money impacts our ability to move forward on a variety of critical public welfare issues like healthcare, gun control, immigration, and climate change. Work on environmental issues is not new to the League, nor is it a sideline. In fact, environmental work is considered one of the highest advocacy priorities of the League The League has been in the forefront of efforts to protect air, land, and water resources since the 1960s, and is working in that area to this present day. We fought for the enactment of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, and other effective regulatory programs, like currently the Clean Power Plan. The League supports legislation that seeks to protect our country from the physical, economic, and public health effects of climate change, while also providing pathways to economic prosperity. The League was established from its inception as a grassroots organization, a true grassroots organization, with members working to bring change through efforts at the local, the state, and the national level. There are League groups at each of these levels. The League's mission is to provide, no matter what the area is that we're focused on, objective, nonpartisan information to build member and public awareness of the critical issues that are facing society. And our belief is that an educated and aware electorate will lead to engaged and informed citizens. Averting the damaging effects of climate change, averting the accidental and damaging effects of climate change requires that individuals, organizations, and governments at the local, state, and national and international levels work together. By raising public awareness of the causes and likely impacts of climate change, helping citizens learn what they can do to protect the environment, and building broad support for effective climate solutions, we work to put our country and our planet on the path to a sustainable future. We now have clear evidence that a path toward a clean energy future will strengthen our economy, while also freeing America from its dependence on fossil fuels, reducing threats to our health, protecting the natural resources that we all rely on, and creating domestic jobs, keeping dollars generated at home rather than abroad. So preservation of a healthy environment is a top priority. The League supports clean energy policies such as energy efficiency, probably the most cost-effective way of reducing emissions, and the transition to renewable energy. And that transition, we believe, needs to happen sooner rather than later. We oppose irresponsible drilling, fracking, mining operations, and pipeline expansion. The League has supported carbon pricing as the most effective tool for reducing emissions and consumption of fossil fuels since 2008. Members of the League's Climate Action Task Force wrote a very comprehensive white paper comparing carbon pricing mechanisms, and that was published in 2009. In 2014, a resolution to support carbon pricing was unanimously adopted at our National Convention. League leaders have created a Price on Carbon website, and it's called priceoncarbon.org, to provide background and current information on carbon pricing. And just this summer, a national team of League members was established to promote state and local League efforts to support adoption at the state level of the Clean Power Plan, which now includes carbon pricing as an approved and recommended approach for addressing global warming emissions. We support carbon pricing either as a cap and trade system or carbon fee, whether it's revenue neutral or revenue positive, because we know that carbon pricing works to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, an urgent issue, without hurting our economy. We have direct evidence of the success of carbon pricing models through our experience in the Northeast with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, as well as the results in British Columbia. And Mark referred to British Columbia as probably the closest example to what we could enact here in Massachusetts. And I think it's also important to note that cap and trade and carbon fees are not mutually exclusive. They can be complementary and work together. So there are challenges for sure, particularly in light of the millions of dollars the fossil fuel industry has spent to stall government action through lobbyists and donations to campaigns, both parties, by the way. We also know about the concerted efforts to manufacture doubt about the science and reality of climate change, and that has been a very effective campaign on the part of the industry. I included this clip of Stephen Colbert. I don't know if any of you ever saw the segment that he did on the IPCC report back in July of 2014, where he described the greenhouse effect and the green Senate effect. And of course, what he was talking about was the money that plows into the system. So, with Congress sort of paralyzed, basically, and stuck as it is currently, what can we do? Well, the action at the state level is the critical piece, and that is the lever for change that we need to move us forward. Massachusetts just missed being hit by 4 so-called 100-year storms between 2012 and 2014. It was just a matter of tide height. We've paid and will continue to pay billions to deal with the social cost of climate change. The cost of doing nothing will be far greater than the cost of efforts we make now to address climate change. And those costs of doing nothing will be for non-productive efforts like rebuilding after devastating storms, not building towards a sustainable future. We really cannot afford to delay. We need to act now. Putting a price on carbon emissions is an efficient, tried and true way to reduce global warming emissions without hurting the economy, and with benefits that are evident soon after implementation. Massachusetts is poised to be the first state in the nation to pass carbon pricing legislation. And we hope that you will add your voice to support that pending legislation and make it a new reality for the future and for them. Thank you very much.
Good evening. I'm Kathy Buckley, chair of the Massachusetts Sierra Club, which is the oldest and largest grassroots environmental group in the country. And I wanted to just point out, besides Lana being on our board, we also have Debbie Cook and Blossom Hogue as officers as well. It's a great group. I want you to join. It's only $15. And I'll tell you why you need to join 350 and Sierra Club and all the organizations, because it doesn't cost much. When we go into the State House and we start lobbying, it's really great to say that we have 1,700 members in Hingham Park. Maybe we don't have that many, but you get the point. The more the merrier. I want to ask a question along the lines of what Lana just said. How many of you are here for a climate-related talk for the first time in your life? I thought so. So here's an assignment. Next time you come to one of these, you got to drag along a colleague, a former colleague, a relative, a neighbor. One of the things we really have to do is increase the number of people who understand what is going on here. There's also a few people who are on the Breaking Point Cape Wind March. Raise your hand if you went on that march. Yeah, I was there with, I'm also active with 350. I'm with the Transportation Working Group there. You can be active in more than one group too, of course. Besides putting the price on carbon, another thing we have to do is take subsidies away from fossil fuels. Right now, the ratio of subsidies for renewables, subsidies for fossil fuels compared to subsidies for renewables is 6 to 1. So that's ridiculous, of course. Okay. So, as Mark said, pricing of carbon is elegant, it's simple, it's straightforward, and the Sierra Club basically supports the price on carbon. The 100% going back to the consumer is, indeed the simplest. It's going to be the easiest to sell, but obviously we'll take whatever the price is, and wherever it goes, it's just got to be there. The cost of a ton of carbon dioxide is now, measured by EPA, is about $40. The average person in the United States, not personally, but if you take all all the carbon dioxide emissions and divided by the population, and you end up with 20 tons per person. So that means that if we were paying that $40, we'd be talking about $800 a year. The European Union, by the way, the average there is 10 tons per person. That Reggie that Mark mentioned, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that's essentially the equivalent of putting $2 to $3 on a ton. California's equivalent is about $12 a ton. You know, these are equivalencies. Sweden, $125 a ton. Now, their electricity is almost totally non-fossil fuel, but we can't really replicate them because they have a lot of hydro and they have a lot of nuclear. Interestingly enough, you know who has the price on carbon internally within the company? Yes. Exactly. You knew though, huh? Exxon. They have been putting a price on carbon dioxide for a long time. They set it at $60 a ton. Back when the United States was saying $20 a ton. When they're going to build a facility, they will look at the energy cost, the fossil fuel cost, and they'll decide, okay, should we put the facility in Corpus Christi, or should we put it in West Texas where there's a lot of wind? And that's part of their business plan. Of course, they know climate change is real. Now, I just want to talk a little bit more, getting back to what Andre was saying, what the situation is that we're in. You're all professionals here, so you probably know that carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere for approximately 100 years, and then it kind of falls out, and I don't understand the chemistry exactly, but so just think for the next 20 years, between 2015 and 2035, we're going to lose some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that's the carbon dioxide that we put up there in 1915 to 1935. And that was a lot less than we're putting up there now. So this is part of our difficulty that, even if we go to zero tomorrow, we still have some real serious effects that we haven't even seen yet. Sorry, I write stuff and then I turn it all around. So what we're doing with the price of carbon is we're pushing the bad away, and we're taxing what's not good, and we're increasing what's really good, the renewables. And what's great about renewables versus fossil fuels are a commodity. The prices are very volatile. As you have less, the prices go up, and but it goes all over the place. The nice thing about a technology-based energy system is the price keeps going down. If you're the first one to buy a phone, you pay a lot of money, and then 2 years later, you think, oh my goodness, that's amazing, it's gone down so much. So that's great about our energy future. It's going to be less expensive. The wind and the solar, and then, as Mark mentioned, it's really great for our economy because we are not a fossil fuel state. We don't have to worry about, what some of the states are going to be going through during this transition. And finally, I just want to, talk again about the seriousness of the situation that and why we need to get a lot more people involved. My son was born in 1989, the same year as Hurricane Hugo. At that time, the most expensive storm in the history of the United States. It's no longer in the top 10. So just imagine what it's going to be like 20 years from now. Where's Sandy going to be? Where's Irene going to be? Where's Katrina going to be? And think about how we're going to feel if we're still in the fight and we're moving in the right direction versus at some point we may have to say, no, we didn't make it. Now just imagine if you could come back to right now when we still have time and to really think about what does it mean to be all in? What does it mean to give your all? Because folks in this room know what's at stake here. So we are now in the game and we really have to put everything in, and what does that mean to each one of us? So that we can say 20 years from now, we won, and I was there.